The removal of obstacles. The removal of obstacles. It's a great way to think about apologetics. Because what happens is that so many people who attack the Catholic faith or have good faith questions about what we believe have an obstacle, something sitting in the way, right? Like my dad, oh, you worship Mary. It's like, well, not really, no. So you have to do away with that. No, but Carl Keating wrote a book called Catholicism and Fundamentalism. It came out in 1988. And one of my introductions to the Catholic faith was through that book. I was just beginning, after having attended Bible college for a couple of years, I moved to Portland in 1991. And about a year or so after that, I was at Powell's bookstore, and I'm starting to wonder about the Catholic Church, despite my understanding that, of course, Catholicism is founded by Satan, and it's pagan, and it's horrible, and it's all these bad things. Things that I was raised with. I was raised in a very, very anti-Catholic fundamentalist background, and I'll be talking a little bit about some of that as we go forward. But I went to Powell's, and I was looking through the section, the Catholic section, and there was this book, Catholicism and Fundamentalism, and I glanced at it, looked kind of interesting, but then I put it back. And there was another young guy there, and he, providentially, I think in hindsight, he said, that's a really great book, I highly recommend it. And I said, well, which one of these are you? He said, well, I used to be fundamentalist, I'm now Catholic, and I'm actually here getting books on the Trappist, I'm thinking about becoming a Trappist monk. Whoa. And I thought, what is that? And so we had a nice little talk, and so I took his advice and I bought the book, and I also bought a copy of a book that I know many of you have heard of, even though if you're a cradle Catholic, you've never read it. It's called The Catechism of the Catholic Church. And bought that as well and ended up reading that. In fact, I know probably about 7 or 8 different people, maybe 10 people personally, who have become Catholic largely through reading and studying the Catechism of the Catholic Church, because it's kind of one-stop shopping. One of the intimidating things about approaching the Catholic Church, if not Catholic, is where do you start? Where do you start? Where do you begin? So Catechism has been a great gift, and something I'll be quoting as we go through these 4 weeks of looking at apologetics. So that book, Catholicism and Fundamentalism, was one of the first works of Catholic apologetics that I read, and it was very, very helpful to me because even though I knew a lot that was already in there, Carl Keating really distilled a lot of things a lot of questions, he answered a lot of questions that have been growing in my mind about a whole host of things related to anti-Catholic fundamentalism and so forth, which I knew from the inside, but his perspective coming from the outside as a lifelong Catholic and knowing the faith and having a lot of history and theology and so forth is very helpful. But my interest in apologetics actually goes back to when I was a fundamentalist Protestant, and at various times we would attend or go to various seminars or meetings where we would basically have courses in apologetics, kind of like this. One of the first I remember was a video series done by Josh McDowell. How many here have heard of Josh McDowell? Okay, a number of you, okay. So Josh McDowell's a very famous evangelical apologist, wrote a very famous bestseller called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And it's actually quite good. Certainly would disagree with him on some points. What you're going to find as we go through here, I'm actually going to be referencing a number of evangelical apologists who really have done great work when it comes to combating things like skepticism and beliefs about Christianity that come from an antagonistic perspective, whether that be atheism or so forth. There's a lot of great work. There's a lot of great work being done by evangelical scholars in the realm of scripture scholarship. So one of my most recent books is titled, Did Jesus Really Rise from the Dead? And the book only has one word in it. Yes, that's the entire book. But don't let that stop you from buying it. It's still very handsomely produced. So, if you look at the bibliography of that book, which is about 12 pages long, I got most of them off the website of Oprah Winfrey. It's very helpful. Many of those books, in fact, I estimate that probably 75% of the books I use and I reference in that particular book on the resurrection come from evangelical scholars. And yet in the course of this, especially I think in week 3, I'll be actually looking at some evangelical, they range from either attacks or just disputes with the Catholic Church, Catholic faith, and we'll be refuting some of those, looking at some of those. As you probably know, when it comes to the term Protestantism, there's an incredibly wide range. In fact, there's some Protestant groups that are so Protestant they're not even Protestant anymore. You know what I mean? It's that crazy. So apologetics, really going back to the time when I think that Josh McDowell series, I think I was about 10 years old, 11 years old, it made a real strong impact on me. I think that I felt as a fundamentalist Christian, even though I didn't think myself a fundamentalist, I thought of myself as a Bible Christian, a Bible-believing Christian. I felt like there were things I didn't understand about how would I explain, why we believe in this about the Bible, or why we believe Jesus rose from the dead, and so forth. And then when I went to Bible college, I was very fortunate that I took a couple courses in apologetics there. And one of the things that came through in those courses, and something that'll certainly come through in what we talk about here, is the close and important relationship between faith and reason. That it is eminently reasonable to be a Christian, to be a Catholic. There's nothing contrary to reason. There are things that we believe that are super rational, that is, they go beyond just mere reasonable explanations. We can't explain in a certain way. We can't prove, of course, the Trinity. We can't necessarily prove the incarnation, although we'll argue that we can actually prove the existence of Jesus Christ, who we believe, of course, is the incarnate Word of God. But that's something that came through in an evangelical Bible college. And I was fortunate to have professors who were pretty adept in philosophy. And I think one of the problems that we have when it comes to apologetics as Catholics is that we as Americans, to put it real bluntly, we really suck at philosophy. To put it in that blunt term, we really stink at philosophy. We've had as many decades of, not just at lower levels, grade school, high school, but even at college level, where there's just not a firm grounding in philosophical thought, whether it be Thomistic or even other forms of philosophy. And so I'm going to shock you here and tell you something that you probably have never really thought about, but we live in a time and an era where good thinking just doesn't take place that much. Yes. I know, I'm glad you're sitting down. And by good thinking, talking about thinking that where people are actually willing to follow things to their conclusion, even if it goes contrary to their emotions, contrary to what maybe they've always known. I didn't want to become Catholic. My conversion was not somehow dramatic. It took place over about 3 years. But I just kept reading everything from Aquinas and Chesterton and a few popes here and there. My running joke is that, Catholics get kind of bashed on for not sharing their faith, right? Catholics don't share their faith. So my experience of becoming Catholic is that I encountered dozens, if not hundreds of Catholics who are constantly telling me about the faith. It's just that they're all dead. Now, to be fair, I also wasn't seeking out a lot of live Catholics. It was a lot easier to seek them out in books, right? And I was very fortunate then that when we finally went over at St. Paul's Parish in Eugene, Oregon, we lived right across the street from it at that time. Met Father Tim Makaitis. Some of you might know him. I think he's in Salem now. A wonderful priest, and they had a great RCIA program there. We had a really fantastic experience. In fact, there was a lot of apologetics even in that RCIA program. So, Catholics get maybe kind of put down for those things, but I don't think that's really true. I think a lot of Catholics really do want to share their faith. I think the fact that you folks are here tonight, indicates this interest in knowing how to try to explain, to defend, to share what we believe as Catholics, and to do it in a way that's hopefully winsome and gives glory to God, because that's really the goal. Okay, I want to start with kind of a big picture question. Stepping back, and this actually is related to the book that I just mentioned a bit ago. My question is this: What did the very first Christians proclaim and defend? What did the very first Christians proclaim and defend? And I think this is a question actually to put to non-Christians. Because, I'll throw out another question. How many of you have heard something like this? Well, Jesus taught nothing but love and tolerance. Heard that one? Would that be Jesus in the Bible? Like in the Gospels? Like the 4 Gospels? That Jesus? Because if you're actually saying that, you haven't read the 4 Gospels. You haven't read. I wish I had a buck for every time I've seen that or heard that. It comes through a lot. Or early Christianity was really just about sharing, about being a community, right? Oh, okay. So I go back to this first question. What did the first Christians proclaim and defend? Did they defend a moral system? No. And proclaim a moral system? No. No. That eventually became part of what was included, obviously. Obviously, there is morality to Christianity. I'll explain maybe a few bumps in the road we've had, like in recent weeks regarding Catholics and abortion, for example. Did the early Christians focus on explaining Jesus' parables? No. What was the one thing, again and again, we see, especially like in the Acts of the Apostles, but also in the writings of St. Paul, that was being proclaimed and defended? The resurrection, is our way we said it. And this is going to be something I come back again and again, and then I think in the 4th part of the series, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on the resurrection. And not just because I wrote a book about it, but because I think this is integral to any kind of real Catholic apologetic. It has to always come back to the person of Jesus Christ. And when we're talking about the person of Jesus Christ, we really, in many ways, have to come, even though there are many aspects of it, and obviously there's his passion, death, resurrection, there's his teachings, etc. But I think the resurrection is really key, and I'll get into that more, especially I think in the 4th part of our series. So here's an example of this. Here's Peter in his famous sermon at Pentecost, Acts chapter 2. Here's what he says. Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs, which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. But God raised him up, having loosed the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it. So, what's interesting about that whole Pentecost sermon, one thing that's interesting to me is that, we sometimes think of Paul as the great theologian, which he was, and Peter is kind of like, he's the bread and butter guy, right? He's kind of the rash. Actually, that sermon in Acts 2 is a very theologically sophisticated homily. It's a really brilliant bit of rhetorical and theological work. But at the very center of that argument, again and again, is the fact that this Jesus God raised up, and of that we are witnesses, Acts 2:32. Peter makes this point 4 or 5 times, both in that sermon at Pentecost and also a little bit later in the next chapter, when he and some of the other apostles are out near the temple, kind of proclaiming again and again this message. It always comes back to the resurrection of Christ. And the thing that Peter says, and we see it also in John and so forth, is this emphasis on the fact that to this we are witnesses. We are witnesses. We saw it. We were there. We were witnesses to the life of Christ. We were witnesses to the resurrected Christ, and so forth. And this term witness, as some of you probably know, the Greek word for that is martyria, where we get the word martyrdom, right? So, of course, martyrdom has become for us to have a very specific meaning, those who die for the faith, killed for their witness to Christ. But in the New Testament, it has a little bit of a broader meaning, and it really has to do with testimony and witness. And this idea of testimony and witness is so vital to comprehending the way that the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles portray how the apostles and the writers of those evangelists and so forth, how they portray their understanding of Christ. We are witnesses. In the case of Luke, he talked directly to the witnesses. If you recall at the very beginning of the Gospel of Luke, he talks about how I set out to write an account, Theophilus. And he talks very much like a Greek historian would talk. I set out to give an account of the things that happened, and I basically went and I talked to people, and I wrote it down, and I've compiled this and put it together so that you would know what actually happened, what Jesus Christ, who Jesus Christ was, what he said, what he did, etc. And so I go through that because apologetics is very much bound up in witness, in testimony. You can have a lot of great arguments, you can have a lot of great facts, and you should. You need to have those. You can't just, emote all the time. Not that that's popular. I'm not saying that's what people do today. I think it's Jonah Goldberg who described social media as the devil's latrine. I think there's something to that. Even though I have to spend a fair amount of time on it because of my work. I'm editor of Catholic World Report, which is entirely online and free, CatholicWorldReport.com. Over 50% of our traffic is driven by Facebook. And it's just a fact of life. I don't let it depress me, but it's it's very interesting reality. But as we know, the discourse that we see, if you're spending time on social media, the kind of discourse that we see, predominantly, not always, there are exceptions, is heavily emotive. It's very difficult to cut through the emotion. It's very difficult to get people just to say, let's just exchange, let's converse. We know that we're going to disagree on some points, but let's talk about it. Let's do it. There is an art to it, and part of that art comes from really just having a solid spiritual life, because you're going to be so tempted to sin when it comes to conversing with people in certain situations, especially if it's online. In fact, I would say in many ways to avoid apologetics online, depending on your personality. Know your weaknesses, right? I learned this, this was, went to the church in 1997, and it's right around that same time. So, there were early on in the advent of the internet, as far as widespread use, there were a number of kind of apologetic message boards and so forth that were out there, and I was very interested in those and did a lot of, reading of those and spouting off on those. And I ended up getting into a really protracted and ultimately ugly kind of encounter with a Calvinist lady, diehard Calvinist, which meant, of course, that I, as someone becoming Catholic, was a moron, an idiot, stupid, etc. For some reason, I took exception to being called these things, and she became increasingly nasty in her language, and I reciprocated in kind, because I'm a giver. And there came a point where I wrote a couple things, and I realized that I crossed the line, and I ended up having a couple long talks with my Father Richard Janowitz, who's a pastor at Activity of the Mother of God, where we attend in Springfield, and I just realized that I was going to have to learn how to control myself, or else shut up online. And so you have to learn, when it comes to apologetics and defending the faith, you have to know what your weaknesses are and know what your strengths are. Everybody has a different set of abilities when it comes to those things. So I've been using the term apologetics as though I assume that everybody knows what it is, but I want to go really basic and talk about what is apologetics and kind of make a couple of distinctions here and also show some of the scriptural basis for apologetics. Of course, we have the jokes about apologizing for being Catholic, apologizing for not knowing about anything about the Catholic faith. And then we can also say, I'm sorry that you're not yet Catholic. That's another one you can try. I tried a variation of this on my father years ago. My father is the founding elder of a fundamentalist Bible chapel. And first of all, my parents are I've learned so much from my parents, love of Christ, love of Scripture, fantastic people in so many ways. But they did not take it well when they found out we were becoming Catholic. My mom's words were, "Those people have brainwashed you." And I said, "Well, they did a good job because I don't even know who you're referring to." "Maybe it's the Jesuits." And by golly, I've been working for a Jesuit apostolate since 2004, so who knows? But one time early on, so my mother and I couldn't have a conversation. It was very emotional for her. And I did not handle it well. So my dad and I would talk, and one of the great things about my dad is he's a man of integrity, and you can just say, he doesn't lose his cool. And I said, Dad, tell me, what are the 3 main objections you have to being Catholic, for me becoming Catholic? He said, well, you have to worship the Pope, you have to worship Mary, and you believe the Pope can't sin. I said, well, great news, Dad. None of those things are anything the Catholic Church teaches, so you can now consider becoming Catholic. And for some reason, that particularly subtle approach did not work. He did not care for that approach at all. So you just learn you have to dial it down at times. So apologetics comes from a Greek word, as many of you might know, apologia. Apologia. See how my handwriting is. Of course, that's the basis for apology. And actually, in the ancient world, like in the Greek world, there were a lot of apologies written. And by apologies, we mean kind of formal defenses or explanations of why one holds a particular view or stance. Now, this word apo comes from away. Apo, away, logia, word, logos, right? Speech, away, or to, in other words, it basically in Greek it refers to speaking in such a way to clear away the accusations, to do away with the accusations that are made against them, the claims. So the idea the word inherently has a very kind of defensive quality to it. And that's certainly one aspect of what we would call Catholic apologetics, a defensive side to it. I'll talk about that in a moment. So you think of like Socrates. Socrates himself, I think I'm correct in this, he actually never wrote anything down, at least it survived. Plato was the one who recorded all those different things. But Socrates made a very famous apologia or apologetic when he was sentenced to death by the Athenian court. Very famously was given the choice to either leave or to drink the hemlock. And then Plato wrote an apology which gave further evidence for why Socrates was not guilty of the charges against him. But apologetics really can be used in a lot of different ways as a broad term. You can have apologetics when it comes to politics or to sports. I'm from Eugene. I live in the shadow of a huge church called Olson Stadium. Yes, I've been there. I have worshiped there. And we beat the Huskies when I was there. But Christian apologetics really is rooted in, and when I say Christian here, I would say this, we share this with Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, as well, of course, as Catholics. It's rooted in the New Testament, where the Greek word for apologetics appears 19 different times as either a noun or a verb. And it's usually translated in English, depending on the translation, of course, as a defense. But there's kind of a wider range of meanings than just defense. So here's a couple examples of those. St. Paul, for example, in Acts 22, towards the end of Acts, and if you've read Acts, you know that as things go on, St. Paul is increasingly finds himself in these positions of being arrested and having to defend himself and so forth. And so in Acts 22, verse 1, he's defending himself before the Jewish authorities, and he says, "Brethren and fathers, hear my defense." The root word is apologia, which I now offer to you. And so, and Paul, of course, comes up a lot, not only because he's in Acts of the Apostles a lot, but he obviously writes a large section of the New Testament. And what you see with Paul are different ways to handle different contexts and audiences, right? We're going to talk about this more later as we go through, but Paul knows how to change his focus, his apologia, depending on his audience. If it's Jewish, Gentile. When he goes to the famous Mars Hill in Athens, he of course takes a certain approach, right? As opposed to the approach he would take when he would go to a synagogue and deal with a Jewish audience, where he predominantly referenced Old Testament. Obviously, he wouldn't do that with Greeks. They'd be like, who cares, right? Which kind of, by the way, suggests or points to the way where we're at now, today. We live in a biblically illiterate society. We live in an illiterate society. There you go. But it really strikes me again and again how biblically illiterate we are. There's this kind of a famous story of Father John Newhouse, First Things. Of course, I think it was marked the 10th anniversary of his death. He was a former Lutheran and became Catholic, and founded First Things, a very influential journal. And he has a story, and I forget the exact particulars, but he's being interviewed by a reporter from New York Times about some issue relating to morals. And he made a comment as they were finishing up the interview. He said, well, this is the way things have been ever since that little incident in the garden all those years ago. And she said, what garden was that? Yes. Well, it wasn't the Garden of Gethsemane. It was the Garden of Eden. But anyway, so it's very difficult, of course, to oftentimes refer to Scripture talking to, say, people who we might generally call skeptics or whatever, because they've not really studied Scripture. And worse than that, they really do believe Scripture is just a bunch of mumbo-jumbo and superstition and so forth. The whole thing, well, Jesus just taught nothing, but he never judged anybody. I said, well, Jesus never judged anybody. Well, just read the Gospels, and you'll find that's absolutely not true at all. Another example of the use of apologia is St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 17 and 16. He writes kind of the same thing. I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. So he saw himself as an apostle. One of the things that he was supposed to do as an apostle was to defend the gospel. And I think this is important because I think there's an attitude among some Catholics that to try to defend the faith, to defend the gospel, is somehow either beneath them or wrong, or it's triumphalistic, or it's hurtful, or it's divisive, right? Now, you can do it in a way that's hurtful and divisive. You can obviously do it in a way that's wrong. But to actually defend the gospel, I will give a great quote here later from the Catechism, is something every single Catholic is called to do. Now, here's the most famous, and this is one that maybe many of you have heard. This is one of the most famous passages of the New Testament because it's kind of the most developed in terms of the nature of apologetics, and it comes from St. Peter in his first epistle, 1 Peter 3, 14 and 15, where he writes, but even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed, and do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense, apologia, to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you. Now, I'm so tempted always to stop right there, but he does have a little clause at the end of this, which is always hard for me to swallow, where he says, but do this with gentleness and reverence. Sure. Oh, sure, you got to be nice about it, right? Okay. But 1st and 2nd Peter are really fascinating because even though this is the most overt example, both of those epistles are full of kind of this idea of contending, of fighting for the faith, defending the faith. Peter is writing to Christians in Rome who are really under the gun, who are really in bad situations and are constantly being verbally or even physically accosted for what they believe. And so he's urging them to not be intimidated, not be afraid, not be troubled. And notice he says, sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. It might be easy to overlook that little bit there. If Christ is not at the center of our hearts, then our apologetic endeavors, our desire to evangelize, to witness, to defend are going to be limited. Doesn't mean God can't still use that, but there has to be a purity of motive, a purity of love that comes from this relationship with Christ, right? Now here's a couple other examples where the term or the Greek word apologia is not used, but where the authors of Scripture still talk about either defending or explaining the faith. 2 Corinthians 10:5, again from Paul, he writes to the Christians at Corinth, "We destroy arguments and every proud obstacle to the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ." We destroy arguments. Now that's more like it, Paul. I like that. As you know, Paul was a little bit cantankerous. And note the emphasis here on engaging with the arguments, grappling with the arguments, and then when he talks there about taking every thought captive, kind of this emphasis on using reason, logic. And whereas Paul can be theologically very dense and very difficult, no one can doubt that the man was deeply logical. I mean, he was a rhetorical master, and his arguments were incredibly logical, even if they sometimes were very, very dense or difficult. Here's one of my favorites, and this is from Jude 3. Jude, of course, is a big bestseller at the New York Times bestseller list. One of the shorter books and one of the more unusual books, actually, in the New Testament. Rather short, very unusual, but it has this great verse, Jude 3. Jude's so short you don't even have a chapter and verse, you just have the number. He says, "Beloved, being very eager to write to you of our common salvation, I found it necessary to write appealing to you to contend for the faith, which was once for all delivered to the saints." To contend for the faith. And there's the emphasis on a kind of a certain kind of combative quality. Again, obviously it has to be done in the right way, but certainly not some kind of a milquetoast, roll over, oh, just whatever you say, I don't want to upset anybody. That attitude, you don't find that attitude in the New Testament. You do, of course, find exhortations to be meek, gentle, reverent, of course, but you never find this attitude of, well, just walk all over me. I don't want to offend anybody. That is a late man-made tradition, by the way. So that whole kind of limp-wristed approach, I think, is something that we don't find in Scripture. Now, a really quick note here on apologetics. This is kind of just a trivia. This is absolutely free of charge. Apologetics in the tradition, in the Catholic tradition, has often been kind of incorporated in what we call fundamental theology. Fundamental theology. Now, there's a lot of, oddly enough, there's quite a bit of scholarship about what's the exact relationship between apologetics and theology. And I don't want to get into those weeds too far, even though weed is very popular here in Oregon. I think the easiest way to put it is the very, very close relationship between theology, the study of God, and apologetics, the defense of what we believe. They're not exactly the same. Now, when we talk about fundamental theology, really what we're talking about are the basic tenets, the fundamentals of what we believe. God is Trinity, the incarnation, Christ's death on the cross. These are very fundamental things. And so you can see those, logically there'll be a relationship between the two. So anyway, that's just kind of a little side note. So, as a definition, there are a lot of different ways to define apologetics. This is my definition that has been cobbled together from various sources, and hopefully it's helpful. And here it is. Apologetics is the act of presenting evidence and arguments carefully, logically, and charitably, so that others can better understand Catholic teaching and practice, and can, by the grace of God, encounter the living, risen Christ. Apologetics is the act of presenting evidence and arguments carefully, logically, and charitably, so that others can better understand Catholic teaching and practice, and can, by the grace of God, encounter the living, risen Christ. Cardinal Avery Dulles, great Jesuit scholar, wrote this really exceptional history of apologetics. Ignatius Press published it probably 10, 12 years ago, because Cardinal Dulles himself died about around the same time as Father Newhouse. he has a great quote, which is taken, it's either taken from that book or from an interview I did with him. I was able to interview him by email before he died. It was about a year before he died. But he writes this, very interesting, and I think very telling, because Cardinal Nunez himself wrote a number of books that can be described apologetic in nature in addition to this history of apologetics. He said, "The best apologetics, in my opinion, has always directed attention to the figure of Jesus Christ, with his challenging message, his powerful deeds, his loving self-sacrifice, and his glorious vindication by the Father, the resurrection. He is the great witness of God, and the church bears witness to him. Where the story of Jesus Christ becomes clouded over with secondary questions, apologetics loses itself in fruitless and inconclusive debates. I'm convinced that it is best not to conceal the offense, the scandal, if you like, of the God who died on the cross." And this points to an interesting phenomenon. I was talking to a gentleman before we began about how there was really no apologetics taught for him as a Catholic growing up a few decades ago. And the 1970s especially were an era when apologetics was largely, if not completely ignored, kind of within the Catholic world. Now, you did have some publishers who were coming out with various things, and you had some exceptions to that. But one of my professors in my master's program was Father Benj Pacwa. And I had him for several courses, including apologetics. He was okay. You know. So he speaks 14 languages, like that's impressive or something. But he talks about how he, as a young Jesuit, got very interested in apologetics, and he looked around and nobody was doing it. And he would go on all these Protestant radio shows. This is in the late 70s into the 80s. He would go on these Protestant radio and TV shows, and he would debate them constantly. And he has this great story about, who's the very famous Protestant, I would say Martin Smith, that's not his name, but there was a fairly well-known Protestant author. He wrote a book called Kingdom of the Cults, and he was interesting because he would not put the Catholic Church in there. He did not think the Catholic Church was cult, but he would argue against, various Catholic beliefs. And he and Father Pacwa had established this really great relationship. And so sometimes after they would be on a radio or a program together in person, they would go. They would go. They'd have a drink together, and this Protestant would always tell Father Pacwa, "Don't let any of my fellow Protestants know that I'm drinking alcohol with you." They would. They'll lose their mind. It's funny because I became Catholic simply so I could drink. Without shame. Now, here's an interesting way of thinking about apologetics that is really succinct, and I think it's one of the best short kind of definitions of apologetics. And this comes from Patrick Madrid, who I worked for a couple of years when I was editor of On magazine. And Patrick, of course, has been a well-known apologist for a long time, and he has a radio program on one of the big networks. He said the removal of obstacles. The removal of obstacles. It's a great way to think about apologetics. Because what happens is that so many people who attack the Catholic faith or have good faith questions about what we believe have an obstacle, something sitting in the way, right? Like my dad, you worship Mary. It's like, well, not really, no. So you have to do away with that. So for example, I'm not picking on my parents, I really am not. One of this curious conversation goes back to, we've been Catholic a couple years, and my mother, we really hadn't talked about stuff, but she decided to go after me on purgatory, right? And she made some comment about purgatory. You Catholics are purgatory. And so I asked her, and then, by the way, this is a good approach. I'm not saying I handle this well all the time, but I did the correct thing. I said, well, what is purgatory, Mom? Right? I mean, I can sit there and tell you what it is. And her response, well, you tell me, you're the Catholic. I'm like, well, wait. I said, I know what purgatory is. But you bring up purgatory, so why don't you tell me what it is? So what do you think the response was? It's a second chance. It's a second chance. After you die, you get a second chance. I said, no, it isn't. That's not what purgatory is. Well, why don't you talk to your father about it? My poor daddy is, hello? So we have this conversation, and actually, when you're talking to a really true blue Bible-believing Christian, purgatory is easy. It's really easy. They still might not accept it, but they can't ignore it. So this is the conversation. One of my few successes. That's what I'm telling you right now. I said, Dad, look, can I ask you a couple questions? He said, sure. Now I mentioned my dad is a man of great integrity. I said, do you believe that right now you're completely free of all attachment to sin? He said, no. I said, so if you were to die right now, what would happen? Now, of course, he believes that once saved, always saved. Once I've made that profession of faith, he believes that he's going to heaven no matter what. He believes it. I said, so if you died right now, what would happen? And it was fascinating. I'll never forget. It was like he was struggling for a metaphor, and he came up with a metaphor. He said, well, it would be like my soul would like pass through like a pane of glass, like removing those things. And he said, so it'd be like purging you of those. He said, yes. I said, purgatory. And he said, I've got to go now. We have never revisited that conversation. But see, if because he believes, and you can point to Revelation chapter 20, 21, nothing unclean enters into heaven. He understands that you can have this attachment to sin. I think that's the part maybe that still surprises me. He recognized that there's this attachment that we have. Of course, it's a very Catholic idea, but he innately, as a good Bible Christian, got that. So I had to remove, this obstacle, this idea that it's a second chance, right? As though purgatory exists on the same plane as heaven and hell. One way you can get around to is say there's two destinations after you die. There's two. And they're not in Toledo or Kansas. There's heaven, which is entrance into the actual presence of God, communion with God, the beatific vision. Or hell, which is separation from God, separation from the source of all life and love. Those are the two options. Purgatory, as C.S. Lewis described it so well, I think in The Great Divorce, is like the washroom of heaven. That's where you go when you need to clean up a little bit because you ain't quite ready to enter into the full presence of God. Right? So removal of those obstacles. Another example of this, and this is I don't know if any of you have had this conversation. Any of you argue with a Protestant about calling Mary the Mother of God? You will lose your mind. I've had this conversation, I'm not kidding, 4 or 5 times before, and good people some I've known for years. And the conversation always goes the same way. It's like, well, why do you call Mary the Mother of God? It's like, okay, it's real simple. You believe that Jesus is God, right? Oh yeah, of course, absolutely. Incarnate Word of God, yeah, absolutely. 100% God, yes. And you, yes. You believe that Mary's the mother of Jesus? Oh, absolutely, of course. So Mary's the mother of God. Oh no, she ain't! Oh no! No way! Okay, let's walk through it again. Let's try it one more time. So, one time I was had this conversation with a fundamentalist gentleman I've known for many years, a friend of our family, great guy. And he kind of, said something that kind of caught. He said, well, if you can't believe that Mary gave birth to God outside of time, I said, well, what Catholic has ever said that? The Catholic belief is not that Mary gave birth to God outside of time, as though she birthed the Trinity. No, the Theotokos, Mary as Mother of God, is simply a defense of the reality of who Jesus Christ is. Completely divine, completely human, right? And then he said the argument became, well, that could become confusing, and we don't, you get into these things and it becomes confusing for people, and then they start to fall into heresy and error. And I said, well, but think about that approach when it comes to the Trinity. You believe the Trinity? He says, yes. I said, the Trinity is difficult. It's confusing. You can go a lot of different places with the Trinity and misunderstand what the church actually teaches about, God being one nature, three persons, all these different things, and obviously, there's different ways it's been explained, different language. I said, so you can't use that cop-out of, well, it's complicated. Well, everything gets a little bit complicated when you're talking about, the Lord and Creator of the universe becomes a Jewish carpenter living in the first century, and then later says, by the way, you can eat my flesh and drink my blood. We've got that whole issue to deal with, right? It becomes very complicated, very confusing at times. So, it's really about, again, removing those misunderstandings, removing those obstacles. No, Mary did not give birth to God outside of time. That's not something that we believe. Blaise Pascal, the famous French apologist, the mathematician, one of the most brilliant mathematicians ever, wrote, as you might know, he wrote a series. Actually, he was working on a full-blown apologetics manual, but he died at a very early age. I think he might not even have been 40, I forget. The Pensées, and they were basically these collections of all these different, some a little bit longer, some are short. And in the Pensées, he has this really interesting statement. He says, men despise religion. They hate it, and they're afraid it may be true. Then he makes this really interesting remark. He says, the cure for this is first to show that religion, and by religion he means Catholicism, to show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is true. So he approaches this as an interesting combination of both reason and kind of a wooing, right? Almost like a courtship. And I think that's really important, that when we're having these arguments or debates, and they could be in a lot of different contexts and a lot of different qualities to them, is that you are actually in some way acting in a courtship for a soul, right? So there's a lot of responsibility that comes with trying to defend and explain faith. So a couple of things I get out of this quote by Pascal, by the way, is that no one is neutral when it comes to religion. I'm going to talk about this quite a bit next week. I'm going to talk about worldviews. I'm taking kind of it's not an idiosyncratic, but it's kind of my own little take. I'm actually stealing it from my evangelical past, because I think the concept of worldviews is very helpful, and understand there's really only a certain number of options when it comes to what we understand about reality. There's really a limited number of options. There's kind of a parallel here to the resurrection. A lot of people really vague about the resurrection. Well, anything could have happened. No. Not anything. Only two or three things could have happened. It either actually happened, or it was a farce, or it was a misunderstanding. I mean, there's really only a few. It's the same thing with what we believe about the nature of God and reality. There's only a few legitimate options. But people like to hide behind this vague thing. Well, we just don't know. Well, actually, there's a lot we can know. There's an awful lot that we can know through just reason. So no one is neutral when it comes to religion. In fact, I'll put it this way. Everybody is religious and everybody has a religion. Every single person. Now, they might quibble about the term religion involves, kind of a formal structure. No. Religion simply means what one's relationship is to the transcendent and how one engages in that relationship. That's what religion is. It can be very formal and systematic and ritualistic, which, by the way, is not bad at all. Or it can be very just amorphous, tenuous, emotive. There's some of that in the Northwest here, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I worship God in creation. Okay. So everybody has a religion. There's no neutrality. This is one of my big things. I will probably harp on this until you want to hit me. One of the great myths of secularism is that secularism is neutral. Absolutely bunk. Secularism is a religion. It is a religious system. All you have to do is look at New York State. Look how they reacted when they voted through abortion, because that is the sacrament of atheistic secularism. Alexander, I'm going to try to wrap up here in the next about 5 minutes or so. Let me just give you some smaller discussion. Father Alexander Schmemann, brilliant Russian Orthodox theologian, who's also, oddly enough, very, very pro-Catholic, very close friends with Father Richard John Newhouse. He wrote a great book called For the Life of the World. I know a couple of you here who I know have read it. And he wrote this 50 years ago. And he has the best thing on secularism I've ever read. Because when people think of secularism, what is the first thing that a lot of people think about secularism? It's neutral, and it also, when it comes to God, what is secularism? Atheistic, doesn't believe in God? Agnostic. And that can be true. That can be true. But Schmemann argues actually the difference, or the essential quality of secularism, is not the denial in God's existence. He said that is kind of neither here nor there in a lot of ways for secularists. Secularism, the very heart of secularism, is a refusal to worship God. That's secularism. Refusal to worship God. And that's why we talk about how Christianity is pushed out of the public square. People, you see this attitude, right? If you want to believe in God and worship God in your own church, that's fine. Just be quiet about it. We don't want to hear about it out here. It shouldn't affect us out here in the public square. Certainly don't talk about how we need to worship God. No. That's very offensive, because then what does that mean? That means that I'm not God. Because the number one religion in the world, I think, in many ways, and I'm being kind of hyperbolic, but one of the most popular religions of the past few centuries is people worshiping themselves. Yes. Now, they might not be put in those terms, but when you look at how they live, what they think, what they say, that's exactly what's going on. They worship themselves. So apologetics starts with the idea that there's no neutrality when it comes to religion. And then we need to show that Christianity is reasonable, as Pascal intimates there. And then we also need to show how, through apologetics, that the Christian faith is not some kind of boring moral system, but it is a life of joy and beatitude and happiness, real happiness. Here's a great quote from Timothy Keller, who's an evangelical apologist and pastor, who says that we must know our culture, the dominant culture. We must know it. We must learn about it. That's something we're going to get into next week. Know its hopes. It's a very interesting way of putting it. And then show others that only in Christ will their aspirations ever find fulfillment, that only in Him will the plot lines of their lives ever have resolution and a happy ending. I was just, I'm going to wrap up here in a moment. Earlier today I wrote an article. It was a kind of interesting article for me. It was a story about a young lady, a 27-year-old dietitian in New York City, who on January 30th committed suicide. Now, unfortunately there's a lot of suicide. There's a lot of tragic deaths. This story really struck me, though, because she wrote and posted online, and it's still online, her note. It's remarkable. A couple things that jump out of me when you read her note is she had everything that secularism tells you need. She had a great job. She was healthy. She was beautiful. She was apparently very dynamic. She talks about how she loves all of these different restaurants, and she loves doing this, and she used to travel, and she loves her job, and yet none of it's worth it. It's not worth it. And so she hung herself. And the note is just, it's mind-boggling, because in there she talks very openly about, don't have a funeral. Don't just to celebrate my life, just go have a good meal. And then she says, forget about me. It's like, what is that? And my article is basically, that is secularism. It promises you everything on this temporal plane, but it cannot give you a reason why I should bother living on a Wednesday afternoon. That's stolen from Walker Percy, by the way. He writes about that. That secular humanism makes all these promises. Oh, you can have health, you can have prosperity, you can have all these comforts, etc., etc. Achieve all these things, but it never will tell you what you are. It will never tell you what you are. It does not understand what it means to be a human being. And to be a human being is to be created in the image and likeness of God, who desires to have eternal communion with every single one of us, every single person in the world. And this, by the way, is a topic of a book that I co-edited called To Be the Children of God, The Catholic Theology of Human Deification. That's right, I'm a Mormon. We are called to enter into the eternal life and love of He who created everything. That's the message that we have to convey through apologetics. So, apologetics is an important part of this evangelistic work. It has a close relationship with evangelism. It also has a close relationship with catechesis. I think that every Catholic child who's learning the faith should understand some basics of apologetics, and to know that there is no question that has ever been asked about the Catholic faith that has not been adequately answered. Maybe not by me, but it's true. It's remarkable. The treasures of the Catholic Church in terms of the amount of material and content and richness in terms of theology, philosophy, culture is just mind-boggling. And so it's one of the things that hopefully you go away from tonight with, the understanding is that we, as those who are trying to defend the faith, have nothing to be afraid of. It doesn't work out that nicely, but the answers are there. So I want to close with this great little quote, two quotes, one from the Catechism, which I promised. You'd feel like you're ripped off if I didn't get it. And first, that quote is from Catechism, paragraph 1285. And this is about the sacrament of confirmation. It says, by the sacrament of confirmation, the baptized are more perfectly bound to the Church and are enriched with the special strength of the Holy Spirit. Hence they are, as true witnesses of Christ, more strictly obliged to spread and defend the faith by word and deed. More strictly obliged to spread and defend the faith by word and deed. That's what confirmation gives us. And then Dr. Tom Curran, he's a great quote from Dr. Tom Curran. He's a really talented apologist, lives in the Seattle area. He used this years ago and always stuck with me. He says, God does not call the qualified. God does not call the qualified. He qualifies the call. He qualifies the call, right? And that's all of us, the call.